June 1943. Camp Pickett, Virginia. Private First Class Marco Benedetti pressed his face against the chain-link fence, watching American soldiers unload crates from a convoy of trucks. The aroma drifting across the compound made his stomach tighten with disbelief. Fresh bread, real coffee, the scent of oranges. After 18 months of North African sand, British rations that tasted like cardboard, and the nightmare voyage across the Atlantic in a cramped transport ship, Marco had prepared himself for the worst. His commanding officer back in Tunisia had warned them all. If the British were strict, the Americans would be merciless. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Marco and thousands of Italian prisoners were about to discover would shatter every assumption they held about captivity, punishment, and the very nature of their enemy. Sergeant Antonio Russo stood in the morning formation, his weathered face betraying none of the confusion churning inside him. At 42 years old, he had fought in Ethiopia, seen the brutality of colonial warfare, and spent the last 2 years watching the German-Italian alliance crumble under the weight of superior Allied resources. He expected Camp Pickett to be his final destination, a place of deprivation and humiliation. Instead, the American camp commander, Colonel William Hartford, had just announced that prisoners would receive 3 meals daily, medical care equivalent to American soldiers, and the opportunity to work for wages. Wages. The word seemed absurd. Back home in Sicily, Antonio's family was starving under the strain of a collapsing regime. His wife Maria had written that their village had no flour, no sugar, barely any olive oil. And here an enemy officer was telling him he could earn money picking tobacco or working in canneries. The man standing next to Antonio, Corporal Giuseppe Ferraro, whispered through clenched teeth, "Do you think this is some kind of trick? Perhaps they fatten us up before something worse." Antonio had wondered the same thing. But as the days turned into weeks, the routine at Camp Pickett began to reshape their understanding of what captivity meant in America. Lieutenant James Morrison walked through the prisoner compound with a clipboard, his boots crunching on the gravel pathways between the neat rows of barracks. At 28, Morrison had studied Italian literature at Princeton before the conflict began. He volunteered to serve as a liaison officer between the camp administration and the Italian prisoners, and what he witnessed daily challenged everything he thought he knew about his enemies. These men were not the fanatical warriors propaganda had portrayed. They were farmers, shopkeepers, school teachers who had been conscripted into a conflict most of them never believed in. Morrison watched as prisoners organized evening classes, teaching each other English using donated textbooks. He saw them create a makeshift soccer field, complete with goalposts fashioned from scrap lumber. He observed the way their eyes lit up when Red Cross packages arrived with letters from home. During one of his routine inspections, Morrison stopped at the camp canteen, where prisoners could purchase items using their work wages. Marco Benedetti was at the counter, carefully counting out his earnings to buy a bar of chocolate and writing paper. Morrison approached him with genuine curiosity. "How are you finding things here, Private Benedetti?" Marco looked up, startled that an American officer knew his name. He struggled with English but managed to respond. "Sir, I think there is mistake. This cannot be punishment." Morrison smiled. "What were you expecting?" Marco's expression grew distant. "In North Africa, we had almost nothing. Sometimes 1 meal in 2 days. Water was precious like gold. I saw men become sick from hunger. When we surrendered, I thought Americans would be same, maybe worse, but here..." Marco gestured around the canteen, where prisoners sat at tables eating sandwiches, drinking Coca-Cola, laughing. "Here is like restaurant in Palermo. Better than restaurant, better than my home before conflict." The conversation stayed with Morrison for days. He began documenting the prisoners' experiences, conducting informal interviews that revealed a pattern of shocked disbelief, transforming into something else entirely. A recognition that perhaps they had been on the wrong side all along. Giuseppe Ferraro found himself assigned to a work detail at a nearby farm owned by the Henderson family. Every morning, a truck would transport 20 prisoners to the property where they would help with the tobacco harvest. Giuseppe had worked his family's vineyard in Tuscany since childhood, so agricultural labor felt familiar, almost comforting. What unsettled him was how the Hendersons treated their workers. Mrs. Eleanor Henderson, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and weathered hands, insisted the prisoners take a lunch break in the shade of her sprawling oak tree. She brought out pitchers of sweet tea, plates of fried chicken, cornbread with butter, fresh tomatoes from her garden. The first time this happened, Giuseppe and his fellow prisoners stood frozen, uncertain whether accepting the food would violate some unspoken rule. Mrs. Henderson laughed warmly. "Sit down, boys. You've been working hard all morning. You've earned a good meal." Giuseppe sat tentatively, taking a piece of chicken. The taste exploded in his mouth. Crispy, savory, nothing like the bland rations he had endured for years. Around him, other prisoners began eating, their faces registering the same mixture of pleasure and confusion. Mr. Robert Henderson, a tall man with silver hair and a gentle demeanor, sat on the porch steps nearby. "My father came from Germany in 1885, he said conversationally. Landed at Ellis Island, with nothing but a suitcase and $5. This country gave him a chance to build something. That's what America is supposed to be about, giving folks a chance." Giuseppe listened, processing the words through his improving but still imperfect English. The Henderson farm became his education in a different kind of warfare. One fought not with weapons, but with abundance, kindness, and a quiet demonstration of what a democratic society could provide its people. Back at Camp Pickett, Antonio Russo received a letter that changed everything. His wife Maria had managed to send word through the Red Cross. The message was brief but devastating. Their village had been occupied by retreating German forces who seized what little food remained. Their daughter Sophia, just 7 years old, was sick with fever, and there were no medicines. Antonio's brother had died fighting in Russia. Antonio sat on his bunk, the letter trembling in his calloused hands. Around him, the barracks bustled with the sounds of men settling in for the evening, conversations in Italian, someone playing a harmonica, the rustle of letters and books. The contrast between his family's suffering and his own relative comfort created a chasm of guilt so deep he could barely breathe. Marco noticed his friend's distress and sat beside him. "What news?" Antonio handed him the letter. Marco read it slowly, his face falling with each line. "This is why we lost," Antonio said quietly. "Not because we lacked courage. Not because our soldiers were inferior. We lost because we followed men who cared nothing for our families, our homes, our futures. Look around, Marco. We are prisoners, yes, but we eat better than our families. We are safer than our families. What does that tell you about the regime we served?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Marco had no answer, but he felt the truth of it settling into his bones. As summer turned to autumn, Camp Pickett developed a rhythm that felt increasingly less like imprisonment and more like an unexpected refuge. Colonel Hartford implemented a policy allowing prisoners to attend local churches, escorted by guards who often attended the same services. Italian Catholic prisoners found themselves welcomed into Virginia congregations, where they sang hymns in Latin alongside American families. Father Thomas Sullivan, the priest at St. Mary's Catholic Church in the nearby town of Blackstone, became a regular visitor to the camp. A second-generation Irish-American, Father Sullivan saw in the Italian prisoners a reflection of his own family's immigrant story. People displaced by circumstances beyond their control, trying to maintain dignity and faith in difficult times. During one Sunday Mass at the camp, Father Sullivan addressed the gathered prisoners directly. "Many of you have asked me why Americans treat you with such kindness when your countries were at conflict. The answer is simple, though perhaps difficult for those who served authoritarian regimes to understand. We believe that every person, regardless of nationality or circumstance, possesses fundamental dignity. That dignity does not disappear because of conflict. You are still sons, fathers, brothers. You are still human beings created in the divine image, and that means something here." Giuseppe Ferraro sat in the front row, letting the words wash over him. After Mass, he approached Father Sullivan with a question that had been bothering him for weeks. "Father, I do not understand. We were your enemies. We fought against American soldiers. Some of my unit fired upon American positions in Tunisia. Why do you not hate us?" Father Sullivan smiled gently. My boy, hatred is easy. Hatred requires no thought, no effort, no courage. What requires courage is recognizing that the man across from you, who speaks a different language and wore a different uniform, shares your hopes and fears. He wants to return home safely. He worries about his family. He dreams of peace. When you recognize that common humanity, hatred becomes impossible. The conversation planted a seed in Giuseppe's mind that would continue growing for the rest of his life. Winter arrived, and with it came an unexpected challenge. A severe flu outbreak swept through Camp Pickett, affecting both American personnel and Italian prisoners. The camp hospital, a modern facility that impressed even the American soldiers, filled rapidly with sick men. Lieutenant Morrison found himself working 16-hour days coordinating medical care, ensuring adequate supplies of medicine, and managing the quarantine protocols. What struck him most was that the camp's medical staff made no distinction between treating American guards and Italian prisoners. The same doctors, the same medicines, the same level of care. Marco Benedetti contracted the flu and spent a week in the hospital. During his stay, he occupied a bed next to Private Daniel Green, a young guard from Ohio who had also fallen ill. Despite their obvious differences, one a prisoner, one a guard, the two men found themselves talking for hours, bridging the language gap with hand gestures, simple words, and shared vulnerability. Danny, as he insisted Marco call him, showed the Italian prisoner photographs of his family farm outside Cleveland. His father grew corn and soybeans. His younger sister wanted to be a teacher. His mother made the best apple pie in 3 counties. Marco shared stories of his own family's bakery in Naples, using his hands to demonstrate kneading dough, his voice animated despite the fever, as he described the smell of fresh bread at dawn. "Why you become soldier?" Marco asked one evening. Danny considered the question carefully. "I believed in stopping tyranny. I believed in defending freedom. But honestly, Marco, until I met guys like you, I thought all Italian and German soldiers were monsters. Propaganda, you know? Now I realize you're just regular people caught up in something bigger than yourselves." Marco nodded slowly. "Same reason I become soldier. My government said we fight for Italy's glory, for creating new Roman Empire. Sound good when you're young and foolish. Now I think, maybe glory not worth dying for, maybe family more important than empire." The simple exchange represented a microcosm of what was happening throughout Camp Pickett, a gradual dissolution of the barriers that conflict creates, replaced by recognition of shared humanity. Spring arrived in 1944, bringing with it news that Allied forces were advancing through Italy. For the prisoners at Camp Pickett, the reports created a complex mix of emotions. They wanted the conflict to end, wanted to return home, but many now questioned what that home would look like. Antonio Russo had been corresponding regularly with his wife through the Red Cross. Her latest letter contained news that filled him with both relief and apprehension. The Germans had retreated from their village. Allied forces, including American troops, had moved through, providing food and medical supplies. Sophia had recovered from her illness. Maria wrote that the American soldiers had been kind, giving the children chocolate and helping repair damaged homes. Antonio read the letter to a group of prisoners gathered in the barracks. "Do you understand what this means? Our families are being liberated by the same army that holds us prisoner, and they are treating our families better than our own government ever did." The observation created a profound silence. These men had spent years serving a regime that promised glory and greatness, but delivered only suffering and defeat. Now they found themselves fed, clothed, and cared for by the enemy, while that same enemy simultaneously helped their families back home. Giuseppe Ferraro spoke up, his voice thoughtful. "Perhaps we have been prisoners long before we came to America. Perhaps we were imprisoned by lies, by propaganda, by men who used our patriotism for their own ambitions. And perhaps here, behind these fences, we are finally free." The irony was not lost on anyone present. As summer approached, Camp Pickett received authorization to expand its work program. Prisoners could now volunteer for positions in local industries facing severe labor shortages due to the conflict. The wages increased, and prisoners could send money home to their families through the Red Cross. Marco Benedetti found work at a furniture factory in Petersburg. Every day he rode a bus with other prisoners to the facility where they worked alongside American civilians, many of them women whose husbands and sons were overseas. The factory produced chairs, tables, and cabinets for both military and civilian use. What amazed Marco was not just the work itself, but the interactions with his American co-workers. A woman named Betty Thompson, whose husband was serving in the Pacific, struck up a friendship with Marco. She helped him improve his English, teaching him idioms and slang during lunch breaks. In return, Marco taught her Italian phrases and shared recipes from his family's bakery. One afternoon, Betty brought a photograph of her husband, showing Marco a handsome young man in a naval uniform. "That's Robert," she said with obvious pride. "He's a radio operator on a destroyer somewhere near the Philippines." Marco looked at the photograph, thinking about the strange web of connections the conflict had created. "Your husband fight Japanese," he said carefully. "I surrender to British in Africa. Now we work together making furniture. Is very strange conflict." Betty laughed. "Strange doesn't begin to cover it, Marco. But I'll tell you what I think. I think most people on all sides just want this whole mess to end so we can go back to living normal lives. Don't you think?" Marco nodded emphatically. Yes. Normal life, family, work, peace. These things more important than flags or uniforms. The friendship between Marco and Betty represented thousands of similar connections forming across America as Italian prisoners integrated into communities desperate for labor and surprisingly open to seeing these former enemies as individuals rather than abstractions. Lieutenant Morrison compiled his observations into a detailed report for camp headquarters. The document, titled Psychological and Social Observations of Italian Prisoners of War at Camp Pickett, contained interviews, statistics, and analysis that would later inform American policy regarding prisoner treatment. Morrison noted that recidivism, prisoners attempting escape or showing continued loyalty to the regime they had served, was virtually non-existent at Camp Pickett. Instead, the overwhelming majority of prisoners expressed gratitude for their treatment and, increasingly, a desire to remain in America after the conflict ended. The report included a particularly striking interview with Antonio Russo, who told Morrison, "I spent 25 years believing in a certain vision of strength and national pride. I thought military might and aggressive expansion proved a nation's greatness. But here in Virginia I have learned that true strength lies in abundance, generosity, and the ability to treat even your enemies with dignity. America defeated us not just with bombs and tanks, but with the power of its ideals." Morrison's superior officer, reading the report, remarked that they were witnessing something unprecedented in modern conflict. A wholesale ideological conversion, not through coercion, but through example. Autumn 1944 brought news that would transform the prisoners' status. With the Italian government having switched sides and now fighting alongside the Allies, Italian prisoners in America were redesignated as cooperators. This meant greater freedom, better work opportunities, and the realistic possibility of immigration after the conflict ended. Giuseppe Ferraro, still working at the Henderson farm, received the news with mixed emotions. He had come to love the Virginia countryside, the honest work, the kindness of the family he served, but he also missed Tuscany, missed his aging parents, missed the vineyards where he had spent his youth. Mr. Henderson approached him one evening as they finished loading the last wagon of tobacco. "Giuseppe, I want you to know something. When this conflict ends, if you want to stay in America, my wife and I would sponsor you. We'd help you find permanent work, maybe even get your own piece of land someday. You've become like family to us." Giuseppe felt tears sting his eyes. He struggled to find the English words to express what he felt. "Mr. Henderson, you show me what America really means. Not the America of movies or propaganda. The real America of good people, hard work, second chances. I think maybe I stay. But first I must go home. I must see my parents, explain to them what I learned here. Then, if they give blessing, I return." Mr. Henderson extended his hand, and Giuseppe shook it firmly, sealing a promise that would shape the rest of his life. As winter approached, Camp Pickett prepared for what everyone hoped would be the final months before the conflict in Europe ended. The camp had evolved from a detention facility into something resembling a small Italian-American community. Prisoners had formed a band that performed concerts for both inmates and local civilians. They organized Italian language classes for interested Americans. They even published a small newspaper in both Italian and English that covered camp news and world events. Marco Benedetti had been promoted to a leadership position within the prisoner community, helping new arrivals adjust to camp life and coordinating work assignments. One evening he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him from the dusty battlefields of North Africa to the comparative paradise of Camp Pickett. He wrote a letter to his mother in Naples, carefully composing each sentence. "Mama, I know this will be difficult to understand, but I must tell you the truth. Being captured was the best thing that ever happened to me. I know how that sounds. Shameful, perhaps even treasonous. But here in America, I have learned what life can be when people are free, when government serves its citizens rather than the other way around, when abundance replaces scarcity, and when kindness replaces cruelty. When I return home, I will work to help rebuild Italy into a nation that resembles what I have experienced here. That will be my true service to our homeland." The letter captured what thousands of Italian prisoners felt but struggled to articulate. That captivity had become liberation, that defeat had revealed truth, and that the enemy had taught them more about human dignity than their own leaders ever had. May 1945, the conflict in Europe ended. At Camp Pickett, prisoners gathered around radios listening to the news broadcasts, their faces reflecting relief, joy, and uncertainty about what came next. Antonio Russo stood with his arms crossed, listening to the announcements in Italian that the regime had fallen, that democracy would be restored, that the nightmare was finally over. But Antonio felt no desire to celebrate. Too many years, too many lives, too much suffering, all of it wasted serving men who cared nothing for the Italian people. He thought about his brother, dead in the frozen wastes of Russia. He thought about his daughter, who had nearly died because medicine was scarce while resources were poured into a doomed conflict. He thought about the millions who had perished for nothing more than the ambitions of tyrants. Lieutenant Morrison found Antonio standing alone after the celebrations had quieted. The older man's face carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Are you glad it's over?" Morrison asked. Antonio considered the question carefully. "I am glad the dying has stopped. I am glad my country can begin to heal. But I'm not glad about the years we lost, the lessons we had to learn through suffering and struggle. Italy will recover, but we will carry these scars forever." Morrison nodded. "What will you do when you return?" Antonio's eyes grew distant. "I will go home to Sicily. I will hold my wife and daughter. I will help rebuild our village. And I will spend the rest of my life teaching young people that the promises of glory and empire are lies, that true greatness lies in peace, prosperity, and the dignity of ordinary life. That is the lesson America taught me." Over the following months, Italian prisoners at Camp Pickett began the process of repatriation. Some, like Giuseppe Ferraro, made plans to return to America permanently after reuniting with their families. Others, like Antonio Russo, prepared to rebuild their homeland with new understanding and determination. A few, like Marco Benedetti, decided to remain in America immediately, sponsored by the families and businesses that had employed them. The day Marco boarded the train that would take him to New York, where he planned to find work and eventually bring his mother to join him, he paused at the camp gate. He looked back at the compound that had been his home for 2 years, at the guards who had become friends, at the American flag flying over the administration building. Colonel Hartford stood nearby, watching the departures with satisfaction. He had served in the previous conflict and had seen enough of hatred and vengeance to last a lifetime. This time he had chosen a different path, one based on the radical notion that even enemies deserve to be treated as human beings. Marco approached the colonel and saluted, not as a prisoner to his captor, but as one soldier acknowledging another's honor. "Colonel," Marco said in much improved English, "I want to thank you. When I was captured, I thought my life was over. Instead, you gave me a new life, a new understanding, a new hope. I will never forget this." Colonel Hartford returned the salute. "Private Benedetti, you and your fellow prisoners taught us something too. You reminded us why we fight, not for territory or revenge, but for the belief that human dignity matters more than national pride, that kindness is stronger than cruelty, and that even in the darkest times, people can recognize their common humanity. Go build a good life, son. You've earned it. The exchange, brief and simple, captured the essence of what had happened at Camp Pickett and dozens of similar facilities across America. An experiment in treating prisoners not as enemies to be broken, but as human beings to be respected. The experiment had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Years later, historians would study the Italian prisoner of war experience in America as a case study in effective psychological warfare, not through torture or deprivation, but through abundance, kindness, and the practical demonstration of democratic ideals. The vast majority of Italian prisoners returned home as advocates for democracy and close ties with America. Many immigrated permanently, contributing to American society as citizens rather than captives. Giuseppe Ferraro did return to America in 1947, sponsored by the Henderson family. He eventually purchased his own farm in Virginia, growing tobacco and vegetables. He married an Italian-American woman from New York, raised 4 children, and lived to see his grandchildren graduate from American universities. Until his final days, he would tell anyone who listened about the strange paradox of his time as a prisoner, that behind barbed wire fences, he found more freedom than he had ever known in uniform. Antonio Russo returned to Sicily and became a teacher, eventually serving as mayor of his village. He dedicated his life to rebuilding Italy as a democratic nation and maintaining strong ties with America. He never forgot the lessons learned at Camp Pickett, that true strength lies not in military might, but in the ability to extend dignity even to those who have been your enemies. Marco Benedetti opened a bakery in Brooklyn in 1948. The shop became a neighborhood institution, famous for both traditional Neapolitan recipes and Marco's willingness to hire and help other immigrants, regardless of their background. On the wall behind the counter, he hung a photograph of Camp Pickett, a reminder of the place where his real life began. The story of Italian prisoners in Virginia represents one of history's quiet miracles, a moment when the better angels of human nature prevailed over the darkness of conflict. These men had expected punishment and received compassion. They had anticipated deprivation and encountered abundance. They had prepared for humiliation and found respect. In doing so, they discovered a truth that authoritarian regimes can never acknowledge, that people are won not through force but through example, not through intimidation but through generosity, not through propaganda, but through the simple, powerful act of treating others as you would wish to be treated. The fences at Camp Pickett have long since come down. The barracks have been repurposed or demolished. The tobacco fields where prisoners worked have been transformed by time and progress. But the legacy of what happened there endures in the families those prisoners built, in the friendships that crossed enemy lines, and in the reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, light can break through in the most unexpected ways. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.